discretion is advised.
What is the nastiest thing you've ever seen come out of a human body? I was congested really bad one morning. I kept coughing to try to hack it out as one does, and right as I was getting out of my car at work, I sneezed something fierce, and a massive bloody mucus and what I hope were boogers shot out of my nose. It was so large that my face felt empty, like I had lost part of my body. I wasn't even disgusted, just intrigued and shocked, and relieved, but also stressed, because I thought I was missing some brain matter. Severe tooth abscess. Whole jaw was swollen. Pushed my cheek hard until it popped and blood and pus filled about half my mouth. It hurt so badly that I got tunnel vision, started to black out, and almost vomited at the same time. Do it yourself dentistry. Don't do it, kids. I'm a dermatological surgical technician for skin cancer removal. AKMOS. After removing a cancer from an older gentleman's leg, we stitched him up and applied steri strips which fall off by themselves within a week, so no wound care would be needed. The pressure dressing on top of the steris would simply have to be removed in a day or two. This older gentleman came back to the office 1 month after his surgery complaining of an odor coming from his post-surgery wound. When he arrived, the odor was far worse than expected. Employees of the office were gagging. Also, keep in mind, in dermatology we deal with smelly things such as cysts on the regular. Odor typically doesn't bother us. Upon further examination, we realized this patient never took off our original dressing. Once the doctor came in and removed the dressing, we saw anywhere from 100 maggots burrowed in this man's open wound, all of which had to be manually extracted. Just another maggot Monday. Lancing one of those diabetic cysts, and what came out was a mixture of blood, pus and some thick black, what looked like a burnt French fry. At the end the last bit of pressure shot out everything and hit the wall. Smelled like a copper penny, and what your cast smells like after a week or so. A week after leaving the hospital from having my son via C-section, I was in horrific, screaming pain. Ended up in the emergency room, where it was discovered that I had a softball-sized abscess directly behind the C-section cut. They needed to open me back up and get me cleaned out, but didn't want all that nasty shit to just spill out of me, so they put a tube in me and attached it to a bag to drain it. So I spent a day in a hospital bed with this clear bag filled with putrid, brown, rotting gunk attached to me. It smelled so bad and looked even worse. Why did the bag have to be clear? It's been 15 years, and thinking about it makes me gag. At my friend's house, his dad kept complaining about something in his ear. His wife finally called him a baby and had him lay down, and after pouring peroxide in, out came a cockroach. I don't have an issue with bugs, but yeah, that was 20 plus years ago. When I was in college I interned with a dentist, and he would do a free dental day where transients and stuff could come in and get dental work done. One guy came in complaining of jaw pain. Turns out that he had a baby tooth that never came out that got engulfed by an adult tooth that then pressed the baby tooth into his jaw. The tooth rotted and festered underneath the permanent tooth. The dentist extracted the permanent tooth, and when he did, it shot out a brown fluid that smelled exactly like death, followed by the baby tooth pieces. I pride myself on being pretty calm, but when this happened I had to leave the room and vomit. It pretty much turned me off to wanting to be a dentist. I had a nose job done. After a couple of weeks something started coming out of my nose. It was the blood that filled my sinuses. It looked and felt like my brain was squeezing out of my nostrils. The more I blew into the tissues, the more it came out like a river. It felt so good. It was like my whole head had been clogged by concrete for such a long time. When the last drop came out, I had produced so much stuff I was in disbelief. With a lot of empty space in our heads, or at least I have. I had a badly clogged hair follicle on my chest under my nipple. Started a tiny pimple, and I popped it like any other day. 48 hours later, it was growing and painful. My friend was a dermatologist and I went to visit him in his home. He prepped me in his kitchen and opened it with a scalpel. So much pus came out and was smelly and nasty. Instant relief though. Had a patient with a tumor in his colon due to cancer. The tumor, which was reasonably large, had gotten an infection and developed an abscess which resulted in the infected tumor penetrating the colon wall. The surgeons and doctors were discussing what the best course of action was, and while he waited the patient came to our floor. He was in too much pain to walk, and so when he told us he felt like he had a bowel movement, we prepared to help clean him up in the bed. Pretty standard stuff for oncology nursing, except instead of normal poop, or even the standard bloody fesses we sometimes see, this patient had excreted a foul tube of semi-solid stool with streaks of blood and tumor pus in it. It looked like that striped toothpaste, except it was the kind of toothpaste you'd find in Hell or Nurgle's domain instead of the grocery store. The smell was one of the worst things I've ever experienced. If I hadn't had an empty stomach from not eating for hours, I definitely would have thrown up. Even the tech I was with, who had nearly a decade of experience, had to leave the room with me and take a breather before deciding what to do. Patient ended up being just fine. Surgery was successful and he had no more demon shits. 40-year-old woman finally addressing a sinus issue she'd had since she was a kid. Surgeon found a tiny Lego man she must have shoved it up her nose when she was a toddler. I guess she didn't have the ability to tell anyone back then and it just kinda became part of her nasal cavity. Wu-Tang and Rage Against the Machine were coming to town, and some friends and I had our tickets. We were stoked. A few days before the show, a friend of a friend who was gonna go with gets this giant boil on his neck. He had it cut out the day before and was with us when we walked in the gate. His neck bandaged up. The show starts, and Boyle Dude gets all amped up and says he's gonna go get in the pit. A few minutes later, I see him lifted up over everybody, crowd surfing. I noticed that the bandaging on his neck was starting to come loose. That bandage finally popped off, and this spray of bloody pus shot out. He was in motion, so it shot around in all directions, and there was this 3-foot strand of bandaging that they had stuffed inside the wound, trailing him like a long nasty comet tail. The look of horror on people's faces as they realized what it was hitting them, I'll never forget. Thanks for all the awards. Emergency room nurse here. Ignored breast cancer leading to chest wall erosion. By the time they came to get medical help, you could visibly see lung tissue. She was kept alive by maggots in her chest cavity, essentially eating away infected tissue, staving off sepsis and death. The smell was something. Edit to the people saying the US healthcare system caused this. You're kinda right, but not the way you'd think. This patient had a lot of psych issues that caused her to avoid care. It wasn't a money thing, but rather a patient that couldn't care for themselves, allowed to just exist without someone advocating on their behalf. Took care of a guy that had a disorder where all of the sweat, skin cells, oil, etc. that the skin normally exudes got trapped. He has stopped taking care of himself for years and then got an infection. So by the time he got to us, every single pore was packed full of rotten pus that smelled worse than you can even imagine. And every time he moved even a little, even with breathing, the pus would squeeze out. To top it off, he was 400+ pounds, which just realistically makes it hard to move him to clean well when he could not help at all. Then he would get all slippery with the pus. The odor in that room every time he moved. Ugh. I saw the grossest thing get removed from someone, all because of a right place wrong time situation. I was tasked with fixing a computer in an OR while a patient was in the middle of surgery. The doc was performing a clearing of the patient's nose before he was starting a deviated septum repair. He got a hold of a big mass and was pulling it out. When he pulled it out and put it on the tray, he decided to cut it open to see if there was anything inside. After it split open, there was a cockroach in the middle of the butcher mass. I think it's a tie between when we had an abused, neglected baby come in and a street level addict prostitute. His eye was swollen closed and he had open sores from sitting in an unchanged diaper. There were maggots in the sores in the diaper area, and when we pulled back his eyelid, there was a maggot in the eye socket. That was visually the most disturbing. On the other hand, The prostitute came in complaining of discharge and odor. Upon vaginal exam, there was a green purulent discharge, but there was a foreign body near the cervix. When the FB was removed, it was a used condom. A torrent of putrid discharge flooded the exam table, ushes, and the floor. The smell was beyond even that of a tampon misplaced for a month and necrotic tissue from breast cancer left untreated. It was indescribable. This happened to my mom, but it still was very disgusting to hear about. So when COVID was first rampant, an old lady came into the clinic saying there's a lot of discomfort in her downstairs, so my heavily pregnant nurse mom and her co-worker went to examine her. Turns out this lady has been keeping this super old tampon in her for months and never took it out. My mom said it smelled so bad she could smell it through her mask, and she almost threw up in front of the woman, and her nose was super sensitive when she was pregnant, so it made it even worse. She said she had to swap out with another nurse. They had to shut down that room for the rest of the day to vent out the smell. I worked at a funeral home for a bit. The second body I went to pick up had been alone after his death for 2, maybe 3 weeks in the summer. The cops asked us to roll him over so they could see if there were any markings on his back that might indicate that his death wasn't natural. He leaked. It was thick, dark, and had a texture like egg whites. It also smelled like grape Powerade grape Kool-Aid. Assisting in pathology, preparing slides and paraffin blocks. We received a large specimen one day. It was a breast implant, or what used to be a breast implant, that had been infiltrated by breast cancer. It was both fascinating and uniquely horrifying to see tumor tissue with its own created vasculature growing, suspended, in what basically amounted to a clear jelly blob. Given the department, I did not have the opportunity to meet the patient, but I always wondered what became of them. I hoped things went well for them, or hope that they did not suffer. Right now here, had a patient with an ostomy right up next to a pair of fresh but healing laparoscopic surgery sites, basically two stitched up holes used to perform abdominal surgery with a robot instead of cutting you open. Well, naturally the ostomy was so close to the sites that intestinal contents reached, it kept draining out into the sites, and they got infected. Every shift there were doc's orders to express the wounds. I've been a nurse now for 3 years and I've never seen pus like the stuff that came out of there. It was about the consistency of honey, sticky and gooey and thick, and it was the color of a Granny Smith apple, like comically bright green. That mixed with ostomy smell is why I've kept peppermint oil in my nursing bag ever since. We had a perforated bowel case where they were bleeding into their belly for 24 hours, but since their hematocrit was low they kept giving them blood overnight. The next morning we rushed this person to the operating room and a torrent of blood 3 times a normal patient's volume and shit just drains all at once all over everything and everyone. It looked like that scene from Carrie. It was so much it was running under the door into the hallway. I'd never seen anything like it. Doctor here. I'm an anesthesiologist, so I've seen my share of crazy foreign bodies and rectums, trauma, etc. The one that was disgusting, but made me laugh, was when a street person got a severe foot infection that developed maggots. That part's not funny, although maggots are real brothers here, and were keeping things cleaned up. The funny part was the vascular surgeon who screamed a little every time a maggot dropped on the floor when we were prepping the wound for surgery. She's a really good surgeon, but the wiggly things totally derailed her brain. FWIW, the case went great and the wound improved a lot. Drunk guy on a motorcycle wrecked and was trapped under it as gas leaked out onto him and caught fire. We saw him in the emergency room as he begged for us to kill him. Most of his trunk skin was turned to a leather-like consistency and was too stiff to allow him to inhale much air. The rest of his skin was burned to various degrees. He finally coded and staff basically let him go. About 3 years ago I had started getting some serious itching in my ears. I didn't clean my ears with Q-tips because doctors had always told me it just pushed the wax further. So I done my best with water and a spray bottle for a while to sort of clean it out. Well, I get to the doctor and they flush both of my ears out multiple times. Pieces of earwax as large as dimes were falling out. Once they bunched it all together you have about 3/4 coins worth of wax. I have no idea how I never knew. It was the coolest, grossest thing I ever seen. At least for myself. Had this tiny pimple on my lower back for about a month that was multiplying in size every day for a month. The skin on top was extremely thick and was not able to be squeezed out. I sat in the bath and had someone slice it open and the instant relief was amazing. But the amount of green, brown, orange, red yogurt that came out of that gobstopper was jaw-dropping. By the end the bath water looked like it was just muddy. In her late teens my sister was getting some pretty hardcore boils on the back of her legs that would rupture randomly. Being the loving sister that I am, I decided to check in on her while she at the peak of a boil episode. She was in her room in just her underwear, kneeling at the side of her bed when I stuck my head in the door. Before I could even speak a word, a massive boil ruptured and shot a waterfall of pus down her leg that resembled cottage cheese. I immediately got pretty woozy and dropped to the floor, trying desperately not to puke. I never asked if she was okay, but at least gave her a pretty good laugh with my display of extreme disgust. It didn't come out of me, but off of me. I had a double mastectomy, nipple saving with deep reconstruction. Ended up back in the hospital a week later with MRSA in both breasts. Had to go back into surgery to clean out my breasts. Because of this, around my nipples and running down my breasts I had a bunch of pus pimples, I guess you could call them. Anyway, my nipples fell off into my hands. So much for saving my nipples during my initial surgery. It was on an episode of Dirty Sanchez. One of the guys, I think Dainton, had a massive skateboarding injury on his forearm that had gone yellow and gunky. So he got a stick and ran it over the thin skin on top of the wound and basically scraped it empty. It came out like mustard from a squirt bottle. In real life, a colleague of mine got really sick with giardia. We wasn't aware of that at the time and ran to the staff toilets to throw up, but wasn't quick enough, projectile vomited up the wall, fell to his knees and simultaneously vomited again and violently shat himself. It was running down his trouser legs as he stood back up again. Holy duck. When I was in the military I was deployed at this time. We were acting out for a few nights at this base, right? I go to take a fat shit at like 2 AM. MRE's hitting my asshole like Thomas the Train. Run over to the porta shitters. It's dark at this time, I have little light. Start to baby wipe the seat and clean before I sit right. I kick something heavy at the base of the toilet. I thought it was a full canteen. I gave it another light tap out of the way and realized it felt weird and misshapen. I shined my light down, and I shit you not, someone shit a turd the size of a hairless baby beaver and birthed it on the floor. I kid you not. It was the largest shit I had ever saw. Just the thought of that leaving the human body freaked me out so bad I just left, man. That was crazy. I'm a trauma ICU nurse. Something to remember about trauma is that people end up in my ICU after they were just going about their day, then wham, in the hospital they go. Had a 300-ish pound lady whose hygiene wasn't the greatest at baseline get in a terrible car accident after doing some blow and washing it down with some booze. She was in my ICU a few days sedated and on the ventilator while we were putting her back together, and she just kept getting sicker. Couldn't quite figure out why, so kinda to throw in the kitchen sink they called the gynecologist in to do a pelvic. During said exam out plops a homemade tampon coated in all the nasty green, brown, yellow goo you couldn't imagine with a pile the size of my fist. I'm a good sized dude right behind it. Follow this release of Satan's personal brew came a smell so foul it permeated the entire unit to the point we needed HEPA filters to clear it. In my 15 years of being an ICU nurse I have seen the grossest shit imaginable, but this takes the proverbial cake. 6 years ago, when my oldest child was a month old, he developed a life-threatening condition called pyloric stenosis. Between the time he was admitted to the NICU to get him stabilized for surgery and the actual surgery was about 24 hours. During this time he was receiving fluids and electrolytes via forth. No milk, of course, because it would just come back out. So my husband and I took turns for 24 hours just holding him while he alternated between screaming and hunger and sleeping like death. just waiting for the surgeon to be free to do the operation to save his life. Well, what we had forgotten is that the stomach continues to make gastric juices regardless of whether someone is eating or not. His mouth also produced saliva. Because there was nowhere for the liquids to go, he continued to vomit them up at random intervals. By the end of it, the fluid was sort of grey and smelled like death. There were tiny chunks of God knows what in it. Even though his stomach was completely empty, my guess is that it was stomach lining perhaps. Anyway, that's the worst thing I've seen come out of a person's body. The good news is, our baby made a complete recovery and is now very healthy. Happy 6-year-old. Suffice to say, those events were traumatic for me, and I'm still dealing with it years later. Pressure sores on an elderly person can get really nasty. I have seen some fairly deep ones, and they are not something that you want. Apart from the obvious pain for the patient, the smell can be really bad. Unfortunately, when they will not allow appropriate staff to resident ratios, our aged will continue to suffer. I work in a doctor's office. We had a lady come in complaining of green vaginal discharge and a really bad odor. Long story short, she'd forgotten and left a tampon in her bag for 3 weeks. When we pulled it out, it was like pulling a plug from a dam. Green liquid came pouring out everywhere, and it was the worst thing I've ever smelled. The patient thought it was hilarious and admitted that this was the second time it's happened. Had a friend get a nosebleed while on a beach walk. She was prone to them, but I'd never witnessed it. Stopped at a bathroom in a hotel, and she was at the sink and said she could feel it clotting. She snorted out the biggest blood clot I've ever seen. It looked like a 3-inch slug, and to this day I've never been appalled by something like I was in that moment. She said it was normal. I thought it was far from. Literal maggots writhing and falling out of a horribly uncontrolled diabetic's left leg while we were preparing to amputate it as a medical student. Ended up wrapping up the leg in bandages before amputating. The stench was an added bonus, and so pungent that everyone was dry heaving. Some had to take breaks out of the OR, and one nurse was going around dabbing some kind of spearmint oil on everyone's masks routinely to try and make it tolerable. Click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.